Hybrid batteries don't fail because they get old. Most of the time they fail because of one thing almost nobody checks: the coolant running through the power control unit. Not the battery pack itself, but the system sitting right next to it, quietly keeping the electronics from cooking themselves alive. We pulled 4 different coolants, 3 off-the-shelf options, and the actual Toyota factory fluid, and put them side by side to see what really separates a coolant that protects a hybrid system for a decade from one that slowly kills it. What we found wasn't close. Let's get into it. Before we get to the test itself, it's worth clearing up a mix-up that trips up almost every Toyota hybrid owner. When people say hybrid battery coolant, they usually picture liquid running directly through the battery cells, like you would see in some electric vehicles. That's not how Toyota built it. The hybrid battery pack itself, whether it's in a Prius, a Camry hybrid, a RAV4 hybrid, or a Highlander hybrid, is cooled by AIR. A dedicated cooling fan pulls cabin air in through a vent, usually located near the rear seats or under the back seat cushion, filters it, and pushes it across the battery cells to keep them at a safe operating temperature. That's why keeping that intake vent clear of dust, pet hair, and debris matters so much, and why a blocked battery cooling filter is one of the most common reasons a hybrid battery pack overheats and degrades early. The coolant we're actually talking about here belongs to a different part of the system entirely, the power control unit. This is the component, usually mounted right on top of the transaxle under the hood, that houses the inverter and converter responsible for switching direct current from the hybrid battery into alternating current the electric motors can actually use. That conversion process generates a huge amount of heat in a very small space, and Toyota engineers gave it its own dedicated liquid cooling loop, separate from the engine cooling system, with its own reservoir usually labeled directly as inverter coolant. That reservoir is what most owners are actually referring to when they say hybrid battery coolant, and it's what we tested. Why does this matter so much? Because the power control unit doesn't just run warm, it runs right at the edge of what silicon-based power electronics can tolerate. If that coolant loses its ability to transfer heat efficiently, or worse, starts conducting electricity instead of insulating against it, the consequences aren't a slow decline. They're sudden. A degraded coolant can lead to inverter overheating, reduced hybrid power output, warning lights, and in the worst documented cases, permanent damage to the power control unit that costs thousands of dollars to replace. This is a component sitting inches away from high voltage cabling, so the chemistry of what's flowing through it isn't a small detail. It's the whole ball game. So we set out to answer a simple question. Does it actually matter which coolant goes in that reservoir, or is coolant just coolant? We gathered 4 samples: Toyota's factory fill, which is their super long life coolant, a pink ethylene glycol-based fluid using organic acid technology. Then 3 widely available alternatives that get marketed as hybrid compatible or universal coolants. A green conventional coolant using older inorganic additive technology. A red extended life coolant built on a different long life chemistry. And a pink aftermarket coolant marketed specifically as a Toyota compatible replacement. We ran each of them through the same 4 checks that actually matter for a system like this: chemical compatibility, thermal performance, electrical conductivity, and long-term corrosion protection. The first thing we looked at was chemistry, because this is where most of these coolants quietly fail before a single drop even gets tested for heat. Toyota's super long life coolant uses what is called organic acid technology, often shortened to OAT. This chemistry relies on organic acid corrosion inhibitors that form a thin, stable protective layer on metal surfaces inside the cooling passages, and it is formulated to be silicate-free and phosphate-free. That matters because the power control unit's cooling passages include aluminum components with extremely tight tolerances and silicates, which are common in older coolant formulas, can drop out of solution over time and form an abrasive gel that clogs those tiny passages. The green conventional coolant we tested uses inorganic additive technology, the older style of corrosion protection that was standard for decades. It works fine in a lot of engine cooling systems, but it was not designed with the tight aluminum tolerances of a power electronics cooling loop in mind, and it typically needs replacement far more often, sometimes every 2 to 3 years, instead of Toyota's stated interval of up to 10 years or 100,000 miles for the OEM fluid. The red extended life coolant was a more interesting case. It is also a long life formula, but it uses a different additive package than Toyota's OAT chemistry, and mixing incompatible coolant chemistries is one of the fastest ways to cause a problem. When you combine an organic acid formula with certain other additive packages, the corrosion inhibitors can interact in ways that actually reduce the protection either fluid would provide on its own, sometimes forming deposits instead of preventing them. Toyota is explicit about this in their service documentation, warning against mixing coolant types in the inverter cooling system for exactly this reason. The aftermarket pink coolant, the one marketed directly as Toyota compatible, was the closest match on paper. Same OAT style chemistry, similar color, similar marketing language. But similar is not the same thing as identical, and that gap is exactly what the rest of our testing was designed to expose. Next, we looked at electrical conductivity, and this is the test that matters most for anyone who actually cares about protecting their hybrid system rather than just topping off a reservoir. Coolant that runs this close to high voltage components needs to behave as an electrical insulator, not a conductor. Even small amounts of dissolved minerals or contamination can raise a coolant's conductivity, and in a system where the coolant loop sits directly against the power control unit's cooling plate, higher conductivity increases the risk of current leakage paths developing over time, especially as the fluid ages and any protective additive package starts breaking down. Using a basic conductivity meter, the Toyota factory fluid came back with the lowest reading of the 4, which lines up with what you'd expect from a fluid engineered specifically for use in a system with high voltage components sitting a few inches away. The aftermarket pink coolant came in second, noticeably higher than OEM, but still within a range that wouldn't raise immediate alarm bells. The red extended life coolant tested higher still, and the green conventional coolant was the highest of the group by a wide margin, which tracks with its older, less refined additive chemistry. Then we moved on to thermal performance, which is really the core job any coolant has to do. We're not talking about boiling point on a spec sheet here. We are talking about how efficiently each fluid actually pulls heat away from a hot surface and carries it to the radiator to be dissipated. All 4 coolants are ethylene glycol based, which means their base thermal properties are broadly similar: boiling point elevation and freeze protection when mixed correctly with water. Where they started to separate was in how consistently they performed as we simulated repeated heat cycling, essentially warming and cooling each sample multiple times to mimic what a coolant experiences over months of stop-and-go driving, with the power control unit constantly ramping up and down. The Toyota OEM fluid and the aftermarket pink coolant held their thermal transfer properties the most consistently across cycles. The red extended life coolant showed a modest but measurable drop-off after repeated cycling, and the green conventional coolant showed the most noticeable degradation, consistent with inorganic additive coolants generally having a shorter effective service life before their protective properties start to break down. The last test was corrosion protection over time, and this is where the real separation happened. We took small aluminum coupons, similar in composition to the alloys used in the power control unit's cooling passages, and submerged samples of each coolant with them in a controlled, heated environment to accelerate the kind of long-term exposure a coolant sees over years of real-world use. After the test period, we inspected each coupon for pitting, discoloration, and any buildup on the surface. The coupon sitting in Toyota's super long life coolant came out essentially unchanged, a light, even surface with no visible pitting. The aftermarket pink coolant produced a very similar result, with only the faintest surface discoloration, which lines up with its closely matched OAT chemistry. The red extended life coolant's coupon showed light surface deposits, not severe, but a clear sign that its additive package wasn't behaving identically to Toyota's formula in this environment. The green conventional coolant's coupon was the clear outlier, with visible pitting and a noticeably duller surface, exactly the kind of wear pattern that, left unchecked in a real vehicle, leads to internal corrosion, reduced cooling efficiency, and eventually a power control unit that runs hotter than it's designed to. So where did all of this leave us? Across every single test, chemical compatibility, electrical conductivity, thermal consistency, and corrosion resistance, Toyota's own super long life coolant came out on top, which honestly shouldn't surprise anyone, since it's the exact fluid Toyota's engineers designed this cooling loop around in the first place. But the real story of this test isn't that OEM wins, it's how much variation exists among the alternatives. The aftermarket pink coolant marketed specifically for Toyota hybrids came remarkably close to matching OEM performance across the board, which makes sense given its similar OAT-based chemistry, and it's a reasonable option if you can't get Toyota's fluid specifically. The red extended life coolant performed adequately, but showed real gaps, particularly around corrosion protection and its potential for chemical incompatibility if mixed with the factory fill. And the green conventional coolant, despite being widely available and commonly assumed to be a safe universal option, was the weakest performer in every category we tested, especially concerning given how much higher its electrical conductivity measured compared to the other three. What this means for anyone maintaining a Toyota hybrid is pretty straightforward. If you're topping off or replacing the inverter coolant reservoir, the coolant that comes closest to matching Toyota's original organic acid chemistry is going to protect that system far better over the long run than a conventional green coolant grabbed off a shelf because it says universal on the label. This isn't the same reservoir as your engine coolant, and it shouldn't be treated the same way. The power control unit doesn't get a second chance if that fluid fails to do its job, because by the time you see a warning light or a drop in hybrid power output, the inverter's internal components have likely already been exposed to heat levels they were never designed to handle repeatedly. There's a broader lesson buried in this test too, and it's one that applies to a lot more than just coolant. Toyota's hybrid systems have earned a reputation for running reliably for 15, 20 years and well past 200,000 miles, and that reputation isn't an accident. It's the result of every fluid, every seal, every sensor in that system being engineered to work together as a matched set. When you start swapping in components or fluids that are close enough on paper but chemically different underneath, you're not necessarily causing an immediate problem, but you are quietly removing some of the margin that made these systems so dependable in the first place. A coolant that's 90% as good doesn't cost you 90% as much reliability. In a system running this close to sensitive power electronics, small gaps in chemistry compound over years of heat cycling. And that's exactly the kind of slow, invisible wear that eventually shows up as an expensive repair nobody saw coming. If you're due for a coolant service on your hybrid's power control unit, the takeaway from everything we found is simple. Match the chemistry as closely as you can to what Toyota originally put in there. Check your owner's manual or service documentation for the exact specification, and don't assume that a coolant marketed as universal is actually built for a system this specialized. It's a small decision that most owners never think twice about, and it turns out to be one of the ones that quietly decides how long that hybrid system actually lasts. If you're enjoying this video, consider watching the next one, where I break down the exact hybrid battery maintenance schedule Toyota doesn't put in the manual.